Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Blind faith asks us to accept something without question, without evidence, and often without thinking. It wraps itself in comfort, in certainty, in the promise that you don't have to wrestle with life's complexities because someone already figured it out for you. All you have to do is believe. But belief without question is a short walk away from surrendering your autonomy. It's not always obvious when blind faith starts to shape someone's life. It can look like commitment, like community, like devotion. And those things aren't inherently bad. But when faith becomes a substitute for critical thinking, when it becomes a shield against evidence or argument, that's when it becomes dangerous, not just on a personal level, but on a societal scale. History is full of examples where people believed things not because they were true, but because they were told to. They trusted the authority, they trusted the book, they trusted the tradition, and they silenced anyone who didn't. That's not a sign of confidence in truth, that's fear wrapped in conviction. Think about how often blind faith has been used to justify violence, crusades, inquisitions, witch trials, or the rejection of science, medicine, even basic human rights. The moment faith becomes unquestionable, it stops being a guide and becomes a weapon. It draws a line between us and them, between those who believe and those who dare to doubt. And it doesn't stop at religion. The mindset that fuels blind faith can show up anywhere. In politics, in ideology, in conspiracy theories. It's the same mechanism, the same suspension of critical thinking in favor of loyalty to a cause or a group or a narrative. And the moment you step out of line, ask the wrong question, raise a reasonable doubt, you become the problem. This is why blind faith isn't just an abstract issue. It's not about belief versus non-belief. It's about whether we allow ourselves to live in a world where some ideas are above questioning, whether we hand over the responsibility of thinking for ourselves in exchange for the illusion of certainty. We all crave answers, that's human, but there's a big difference between seeking truth and being told what the truth is. One is a journey, the other is a trap, and blind faith, by definition, doesn't want you to go on that journey. It wants you to stop walking, stop questioning, stop thinking, and just accept. That might feel safe. But safety, bought at the price of your own mind, isn't really safety at all. One of the most overlooked aspects of blind faith is how deeply it taps into our fear of uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. It makes us feel exposed, small, unanchored. And so when someone hands us a simple story, a complete worldview, a moral code, an afterlife, a purpose, it can feel like relief, like being handed a map when you're lost. But the map doesn't have to be accurate, it just has to make you feel like you're going somewhere. That's what makes blind faith so effective. It doesn't require understanding, just obedience. The questions that make us uncomfortable get labeled as temptations or distractions. Doubt becomes a sin. Independent thought becomes rebellion. And instead of developing the tools to think clearly, we develop the habit of shutting down critical thought the moment it threatens the system. This isn't just a personal loss, it's a cultural one. When large groups of people are trained to follow instead of think, you end up with societies that resist change, suppress innovation, and punish dissent. You get generations who inherit beliefs like furniture, passed down, never questioned, rarely examined, and the older the furniture gets, the more sacred it becomes. It also leads to a kind of moral outsourcing. People stop asking, what's the right thing to do, and start asking, what does my faith tell me is right? That might sound harmless until you realize how often those answers are outdated, tribal, or even harmful. In some belief systems, slavery was once justified. In others, women were considered inferior. In many today, being gay is still seen as a problem to be fixed. When morality is tied to dogma instead of empathy, it becomes inflexible. It's no longer about what causes harm or what brings well-being, it's about what fits the belief. And that's how we end up with good people doing harmful things, not because they're cruel, but because they're convinced they're right. And not just right, but righteous. That's the emotional core of blind faith. It doesn't just say, I believe. It says, I know I'm right, and questioning me is dangerous. That attitude shuts down dialogue, it hardens into self-righteousness, and once that happens, truth no longer matters, only loyalty does. People often say faith is about hope, or love, or meaning, and sure, those can be part of it. But blind faith, the kind that resists all evidence and silences doubt, is about control. Control of thought, control of behavior, control of community. It creates clear boundaries, believer versus non-believer, sacred versus blasphemy. And the irony is, when everyone agrees not to question, no one notices how fragile the whole thing is. You can spend your whole life inside a belief system, never realizing how much fear is propping it up. Fear of being wrong, fear of being rejected, fear of eternal punishment. So people stay quiet, or they pretend to believe, or they convince themselves harder than ever, just to avoid cracking the surface. But the cracks are always there. Cracks don't always show up as arguments or contradictions. Sometimes they show up as a simple, quiet feeling. Something doesn't sit right. A passage that seems cruel, a rule that feels unjust, a teaching that doesn't match your experience of the world. And if you're raised in blind faith, you're taught to push those feelings down, to call them tests, or temptations, or pride. But what if they're just your conscience? What if doubt isn't a weakness, but a sign that you're still thinking? Blind faith doesn't leave room for that. It treats doubt as a threat, because if you start questioning one piece, the whole structure might start to wobble. And in tightly controlled belief systems, that's not allowed. There are guardrails in place. Rituals, shame, repetition, even love can be weaponized to keep you inside. Because it's not just your beliefs at stake. It's your identity, your family, your place in the world. That's one of the hardest parts. People don't just believe out of logic. They believe out of belonging, out of love, out of fear of being alone. So challenging your faith doesn't just mean rethinking an idea. It can mean risking everything that's been built on top of it. This is why blind faith is so resilient. It doesn't survive because it's true. It survives because questioning it costs so much. And that's how it becomes generational. Parents pass it on to children before they've had the chance to even ask real questions. And by the time they do, the answers are already written in stone. There's also something deeper going on, something rooted in how our brains work. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We look for meaning, even when it's not there. We're wired to want stories with purpose, with design, with someone behind the curtain. Blind faith offers that. It gives random events a reason. It tells you there's a plan, even when everything feels chaotic. But this kind of meaning comes at a cost, because once everything is part of the plan, you stop seeing things as they are. Pain becomes punishment. Illness becomes a test. Natural disasters become divine messages. And the search for real answers, scientific, psychological, human answers, is pushed aside. We've seen this over and over. In places where religious dogma controls healthcare, people suffer needlessly. In places where it controls education, children grow up misinformed. In places where it controls law, the rights of women, minorities, and dissenters are crushed, all in the name of something no one is allowed to question. And often, it's not even about belief, it's about power. Those at the top rarely live by the same rules they preach. They just need the people below to believe hard enough, to obey without hesitation, to sacrifice without thinking, to follow without question. That's what blind faith creates. A population easier to manage, less likely to rebel, more likely to accept their place. But faith should never be used as a leash. When faith becomes a leash, it's not just holding back your thoughts. It's shaping the very questions you're allowed to ask. You start to self-censor. You feel guilty for wondering. You twist your doubts into prayers for stronger faith instead of honest inquiry. And over time, that leash tightens. You're no longer free to follow the evidence wherever it leads. You're only allowed to explore within the walls that were built for you, step outside those boundaries, and you're told you've lost your way, that you've turned your back on truth. But real truth doesn't fear inspection. It doesn't collapse under a few questions. If something can't survive honest doubt, maybe it doesn't deserve unquestioning belief. One of the hardest things to recognize from the inside is how much blind faith relies on insulation from other ideas, from other people, from the wrong books, the wrong media, the wrong questions. That's why so many belief systems discourage curiosity beyond their approved worldview, because exposure can lead to erosion. A single, well-framed question can do more damage to a rigid belief than 1,000 sermons can fix. And this insulation has consequences. It creates echo chambers, it reinforces bias, it teaches people to value agreement over truth. That's how you end up with entire communities where everyone believes the same thing, not because it's right, but because no one's allowed to say otherwise. This kind of environment doesn't just discourage growth, it punishes it. If you change, you're told you're falling. If you grow, you're told you're drifting. If you evolve, you're accused of betrayal. So instead of becoming more thoughtful, more compassionate, more aware, people stay stuck, afraid to outgrow the frame they were handed. And those who leave often pay the price. They lose their communities, their families, their identity. Some are cut off entirely. Others are quietly erased, not because they were cruel or immoral or unkind, but because they stopped believing exactly the right things. That's the danger of a system built on blind faith. It doesn't allow for disagreement without dehumanization. It's not enough to leave quietly. You have to either come back or become the cautionary tale. And all of this happens under the illusion of love. The illusion that everything being done is for your own good, that obedience is a form of devotion, that silence is strength. But love doesn't control like that. And truth doesn't need to hide from hard questions. In a world where knowledge is more available than ever, choosing not to question is a form of surrender. A comfortable one, sure, but a costly one. Because when you give up your right to think freely, you're giving up more than just intellectual independence. You're giving up your power, and when enough people do that, entire societies start to sleepwalk through injustice. When injustice is wrapped in sacred language, it becomes harder to challenge. Not because it makes more sense, but because it's off limits. If a law is unfair, you can argue with it. If a leader is corrupt, you can vote them out. But if a belief is divinely inspired, there's no appeal. You're not disagreeing with a policy, you're disagreeing with God. That's how blind faith protects itself. It moves the conversation away from reason and into fear. Not fear of social consequences, but fear of eternal ones. And once you're inside that framework, logic starts to feel dangerous. Even kindness gets distorted. Helping the wrong person, loving the wrong person, forgiving the wrong person, all of it can become evidence that you're slipping. So people learn to turn off their empathy when it conflicts with doctrine. They learn to mistrust their own moral instincts. And over time, they stop seeing others as people and start seeing them as categories. Saved or unsaved, righteous or sinful, worthy or lost. And the irony is, most of the people caught in this system aren't cruel, they're not hateful, they're often thoughtful, caring, deeply sincere. But blind faith trains good people to uphold harmful ideas without even realizing it. It hands them a lens through which everything gets distorted, and then tells them that's the only way to see clearly. This is why so many people cling to blind faith, even when parts of it trouble them. They compartmentalize, they make excuses, they say it's not my place to question, or there's a reason for everything. But deep down, they feel the tension. They notice the contradictions. They just don't feel allowed to explore them. Because exploration is painted as a fall, as pride, as arrogance, the idea that you could trust your own mind. your own sense of right and wrong, is reframed as dangerous. So even when people start waking up, they hesitate. Not because they're unconvinced, but because they're scared. And that fear is powerful. It keeps people in systems that no longer make sense to them. It keeps them pretending, performing, repeating things they don't really believe, just to stay connected, just to avoid being cast out. But what if we've been taught to fear the wrong things? What if the real danger isn't asking too many questions, but not asking enough? What if the cost of blind faith isn't just intellectual, but emotional, relational, even political? Because when enough people stop thinking for themselves, it opens the door for manipulation. Leaders can say anything, and it gets accepted. Institutions can abuse power, and no one speaks up. At some point, it's not just belief, it's control, and the longer it goes unquestioned, the more normal it feels. Control doesn't always come with chains. Sometimes it comes with stories. Stories that tell you who you are, where you belong, what you're allowed to think. And if you hear them from birth, you stop realizing they're stories at all. They become your world. But truth isn't afraid of questions. Real understanding doesn't collapse when you test it. And love, real love, doesn't need you to lie to yourself to stay connected. Blind faith asks you to stop looking, to stop growing, to accept that someone else already has the answers. But the moment you let go of that, the moment you let yourself ask what you really think, what you really value, what actually makes sense, that's when something shifts. You stop living someone else's truth and start building your own. That doesn't mean everything becomes simple. In fact, it can be harder. There's no pre-written script, no ready-made answers. Just you, your mind, your conscience, and the world as it really is. Complex, uncertain, sometimes painful, but also full of potential. And that's not something to be afraid of, it's something to grow into. Because doubt isn't the enemy of truth, it's the beginning of it. When you question, you learn. When you learn, you grow. And when you grow, you step into the kind of freedom that no doctrine can give you and no system can take away. Not the freedom to believe whatever you're told, but the freedom to think, to care, to change, and to live a life that's honest. Blind faith will always try to convince you that certainty is more important than truth, that loyalty is more important than integrity, that obedience is more important than compassion. But once you see through it, even just a little, you realize something very simple. You were never supposed to stop thinking, and you don't need fear to be good. You just need the courage to ask the questions and keep asking